you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another Podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border. Coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Oh, hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another Podcast by George. Got a returnee on the show today. One of my favorite topics and one of my favorite guests. And of course, I hope you saw the promo for it. It is Captain John Cox. And we're going to start off, or very near the top here, talking about that situation in Martha's Vineyard. I like to cover some of the timely news when it comes to aviation first. There was a fatal accident in Santa Fe. We'll talk about that a little bit. And it's not like these topics are completely unrelated to the big three in the PBG, which, of course, are climate, war, and healthcare. We're going to talk a little bit about heat and climate and the change in the weather and how that's affecting delays and cancellations and all that kind of stuff. And just delighted to have Captain Cox back on the live line. I've always been interested in this stuff. That's me, folks. You know, I'm doing air traffic reports there. Now, I'm not flying. That's the passenger seat there. I'm just riding shotgun with a young pilot back in the day doing air traffic reports. But, I flew with him and then with Captain Jack, rest in peace. I mean, he was a legend in broadcasting here in the Heartland. Captain Jack did air traffic reports for WHO for, I don't know, well over a decade, maybe a couple of decades. But, I would watch him fly the plane, and then I would think, well, what if I had to take over? What if something happened to Captain Jack here and I had to grab these controls and I didn't have anything else to do but pay attention. So I'd watch him very closely. And then I came to the conclusion, probably not. It probably would not work. But let's get to our introduction here and put the captain's graphic up there and give him his proper bio. Captain John M. Cox is a veteran major airline, corporate, and general aviation pilot. He's flown over 14,000 hours with over 10,000 in command of jet airliners. Additionally, he's flown as an instructor, a check pilot, a test pilot. In addition to his extensive involvement in global air safety, Captain Cox authors the Ask the Captain column for U.S. Today. He serves as the aviation analyst for NBC News. We got a clip from NBC with him in it that we're going to play here shortly. And he provides expertise to numerous other media outlets, including, of course, Podcast by George. He also frequently appears as an expert on the television programs Air Disasters, Why Planes Crash, Mayday. God, I just love those things. And his real day job, as I tell folks, is Chief Executive Officer of Safety Operating Systems in Washington, D.C. So let's take that off the screen here. Click a couple of buttons. I got to scroll down here a little bit. Click that one there and this one here. And we'll say good morning to our good buddy, our good pal, Captain Cox. Hi, Captain.
Good morning, George. How are you?
I'm doing great. A couple of topical things here right off the hop. My wife had C-SPAN on before I came on the air here. The House is deliberating on a 5-year FAA program. Now, that's a huge program. Somebody with a Freedom Caucus was up talking about some nut job stuff about eliminating registration numbers on airplanes, and they were talking about drones. But what do you think is a significant, most important overview for that FAA bill?
I think that we need to pass consistent funding, long-term funding for the FAA. The projects that the FAA oversees, the research that they do, these are all long-term projects. And so the funding source for this critical federal agency needs to be moved out of the political arena and into what's best for our country and the leadership role that FAA has in the world. So I hope that the Congress, both houses, can put the politics aside when it comes to FAA and give them the funding source on a regular basis that they need.
Are there any provisions dealing specifically, in your wheelhouse with safety? Maybe something to do with experience, hours, passenger safety, all of these disruptions on planes, anything like that in there that we should be keeping an eye out for?
There has been some discussion because there's a very, very critical pilot shortage right now, worldwide, not just in the U.S. But whether the the 1,500 hours before you're eligible to fly an airliner, whether that rule can be reduced safely as it is in numerous other countries. So that debate has been raging on the safety front. And I think that there was at one point part of this reorganization or refunding bill that they were going to reduce that and also potentially increase the age limit for airline pilots from 65 to 67. And there's political debates on both sides of that, one way or the other. I'd just like to see the funding get in place and left alone for 5 years and then renewed without the unfortunate things of reauthorizations and the politics that wreak havoc with the FAA. All in all, they do a great job, and how they do it with the political pressures that they undergo, it speaks well of the professionalism of those folks.
The big three on the PBG: climate, war, and healthcare. And a lot of times we talk about the money, the appropriations. And I'm a big left winger out here. We're not going to talk about politics today. But what the captain's talking about here with the FAA, that's something I want to spend my money on. That's what I want my government doing. When I'm riding along at 35,000 feet, I want somebody in the governmental agency spending money and keeping me safe, as opposed to blowing the planet up with cluster bombs and other stuff. But that's a topic for another day. All right. So, another thing that's timely, it's historic also. Today's the anniversary of the 1969 lunar landing. Yeah. And, you got to be old, but I am. I was watching that. It was a Sunday on television live. And, my mom let us stay up to watch that. That's for sure. 14 years old, 1969. Captain, what's your remembrances of that? Maybe more importantly for aviation, what's the significance of it?
Well, I think several things. One, I remember it very clearly, black and white television, and just being literally awestruck at the technology and how far we were able to push things and successfully reach the moon they didn't have computers in those days. This was all done with slide rules. This was all done with a lot of calculations that had never been done before. And so this was this cutting edge technology. And this is the same year that Concorde flew for the very first time. 747 flew for the very first time. It was a monumental year in aviation, 1969. And, sadly today, Concorde's not flying. We're not going to the moon anytime soon. And the 747 is reaching the end of its lifespan in passenger service anyway. So we made great strides in the 60s, and we filled in with a lot of technology since then. But I'd like to see us back on the cutting edge of technology and exploration, both in space and what we can do for high speed travel. I'd like to see the return of the supersonics. I had opportunity to fly on Concorde twice. It was a wonderful experience. But 3 hours from New York to London, that's impressive.
Yeah. And, I mentioned in your intro that you were you've done some test piloting. Those NASA guys, those moon landing guys, they're kind of the ultimate creme de la creme test pilots. Maybe people don't think of it that way, but I kind of think of it that way.
Absolutely. And I've had the good fortune to meet several of them and talk to them. Had dinner one night with Jim Lovell. And their approach to things was, they manage risk very effectively. They didn't downplay the fact that there was risk. There was serious risk, but they mitigated it to an acceptable level. They knew it, and they showed us what humans are capable of. And I think they're all to be commended for that.
All right, great. Let's get to the topical stuff and kind of work backwards here. Now, we're going to get to the situation with the woman flying the pilot that I did for piloting the plane, rather than I mentioned and I promoted the show for. But I wanted to get to this one right off the top because this just happened in the past couple of days or so. This is out of the Santa Fe, New Mexican. A morning plane crash near Santa Fe kills the pilot but avoids catastrophe. A morning crash near Santa Fe was so severe that there was almost no evidence it had involved an airplane. All that could be seen was the shell of a burned out house and a large swath of black ash, and yet it could have been much worse. The pilot of a twin-engine Cessna reported a left engine failure just before his plane crashed into a home south of Santa Fe on Tuesday, killing the aircraft's lone occupant and engulfing the unoccupied residence in flames. Now, a state police spokesman said no one else was hurt in the crash, but only 30 minutes earlier, the house on Agna de Oro had been occupied, family members said. And there's the aftermath, and it's just a horrific scene. I've got this video that I wanted to play while we had the captain on here. Now, I just kind of put this together quickly. And this is the schematic of the airport there in Santa Fe. This guy was taking off. Captain knows all of this stuff, but that yellow arrow that I'm showing there, that's the direction that he was taking off on runway 20. You'll hear the air traffic controller come on and mention this. And then things start going awry. So let me play this, and the audio here will pick up very shortly from air traffic control. Let's pick it up.
51 Charlie, runway 20, right turns approved, clear for takeoff, wind's gone. Clear for takeoff, 51 Charlie, thanks for takeoff. 51 Charlie's got an engine failure.
Okay, so just let's break it down here bit by bit. This guy's taking off. He's got an engine failure. If this were to happen, Captain, number one, just your mental checklist, the things that you would do immediately. This is a twin engine plane this guy is flying. He's got an engine going out. I'm always surprised that not only how calm, cool, and collected these guys seem to be, but I'm always surprised that they think to advise air traffic control. I mean, this guy's got his hands full, I would think. Can you comment on that?
When I listened to this, I also was very impressed with the cool, calm nature that this pilot is responding to air traffic control. He's letting them know that he's got a problem, that they need to move airplanes away from him. And that's good. It says that his mental processing of the problem is he's handling it quite well. So the biggest thing right now is to gain what altitude you can. And with light twin engine airplanes, you need to get the propeller feathered. And what you do with that is you turn the blade so that it minimizes resistance and it stops rotating. Both of those improve the aerodynamic flow around the engine and give the airplane the best possibility of climbing. And the other thing is you want to accelerate to the best climb speed for single engine. And that's that you calculate that, and it's on the airspeed indicator of light aircraft. So you want to get those handled very quickly. This engine failure happened quite early, so he does not have a lot of altitude to work with, and that's going to end up being a problem. But it makes the criticality of the situation he's in much greater.
Well, and this one does not end well. You saw the article that we were talking about, so he's aware of this. What about the part about having the wherewithal to contact air traffic control? Would that occur to you? Would that be something you would want to do immediately, or is that something that would be further down the list?
It would probably be a little bit further down the list, but as I say, he's thinking about it. He's practiced single engine work before, so he knows what he's got to do, which is close the throttle, close the mixture control, and then feather the propeller. And that's 3 levers that are on the console. And to get the airplane accelerated, to make sure that the landing gear is up and retracted, all of those things improve the climb capability of the airplane, and they need to be done pretty quickly. But the fact that he's thinking about letting air traffic control know that he has a problem, it says that he's not task saturated, so that he's aware, he's thinking. His voice, the pace of the words that he's saying, the pitch of his voice, all of those indicate that this is not somebody in anywhere close to a panic or a high stress.
Let's play this here. Get this to go here. There it is.
say again? 51 Charlie's got an engine failure. 51 Charlie, roger. You make the left turn to runway 33. Roger, 51 Charlie. 51 Charlie, you're clear to land any runway you want. The winds are calm.
Went on that right away. Now, the air traffic controller doesn't know which engine's out. He does, and he's telling him the nearest runway. That's where that red arrow is at. If you're watching this on video,
Right.
this arrow is pointing to runway 33, which is to his left, which is not preferred, but he may not be able to pick and choose at this point, Captain.
At this point, you probably want to get the airplane up and get it squared away, as opposed to make an immediate return. There's going to be a lot to do there unless the airplane is not climbing well. And at that case, you may want to reassess it and go for the nearest possible runway that you can. These light airplanes, they require a lot of rudder input. You need to get the propeller feathered, as we talked about previously. If you don't have those two things, maintaining control of the airplane becomes very difficult.
Okay, it'll roll on here. Let's continue with it. It doesn't last much longer.
51 Charlie, I'm going to get some altitude. All right.
He's saying he wants to get some altitude.
Yeah,
That's
that's
exactly-
what
The one engine. One engine. Roger.
Yeah, he's very cool. I mean, he's not.
51 Charlie.
Go ahead.
You don't hear, an increase in the pitch in his voice. He's not speaking very quickly. Those would be indicators that he's highly stressed, and you're not hearing that, which says that in his mind, he's got things under control or will shortly have them under control, one way or the other. But this is what you want in a pilot, is somebody that can handle a high stress situation effectively.
Yeah, and again, on the schematic that I have of the airport here, it would be preferred for him to maybe to go right. That's where the green is, to go to that other runway, but it's further away. And again, he may not be able to pick and choose like he would like to. And I have headphones on, but I can hear the one engine straining in the background here as he's talking. Let's roll this through.
Runway 33 is just off your left side. That might be the closest one for you. 28's a little bit further to the north, but your choice. The crash rescue one appears the aircraft is down, but well off the field, about 2 miles off the approach end. I can't tell exactly where it is, but there's a large plume of smoke.
Yeah, and there's the photo again, the aftermath.
Yeah,
rest in peace, brother. I mean, nobody likes to see
sad.
that. The captain, least of all, because he's
sad outcome. Sad outcome.
What about this now? This is in Santa Fe. I've been there. This is a high altitude location. This airport is, it's not Denver, but it's pretty high, I think. And of course, it's been very hot. And so he needs all the aerodynamic help that he can get. And I kind of wanted to dovetail this with aviation in general when it comes to the planet heating up and the hot weather that we're having presently. Again, climate and weather are two different things, but altitude and heat, we're not in this guy's favor, but they're not in any flight's favor, correct, Captain?
Correct. When you get higher temperatures, the air gets less dense. There's fewer air molecules because of the heat. And with that decrease in density, making lift, having the wing make lift is that much more difficult. Airplanes perform better in cold air because the air is more dense. They can create more lift. They can lift more weight. When you get to high temperatures, you have to limit the amount of weight in the airplane because the wings can only generate so many pounds of lift. And when you have situations where the altitude is also decreasing the density of the air and the temperature, now you combine those two, the performance, the climb capability of the airplane can be significantly impacted. And this is true whether it's a small airplane or an airliner. All of the pilots, you make calculations about what is known as density altitude, and what the airplane will how well it will climb, how well it will perform, how much weight it will lift. And all of these are done prior to departure. So this pilot was facing 10 to 15 miles of wind. the loss of an engine with a performance limited airplane due to the altitude and the temperature. So he was in a very difficult situation.
I've got one of my regular viewers here, Suzanne Murphy, the great Suzanne Murphy, and she's, I think, worked for an airline or something like that. She's got a question. She says, planes can typically be flown with one engine. Again, takeoff is a different thing. Something else must have been involved, right? Well, we mentioned the heat and the altitude may have played a role, but and the fact that this thing was turning into the engine that was out, or I mean, it's hard to speculate at this juncture, but do you think it's just an engine failure? Or do you think there's something else involved here, Captain?
Well, I think airspeed control is going to end up being part of it, because the fact that he says, okay, we're going to gain some altitude, and he's starting to make a left turn, which is into the engine that has failed. The consequence of that is the right engine is wanting to push the airplane and roll the airplane. He's having to counter that with the rudder. And there's a minimum speed at which you can maintain that. And if he is not able to accelerate to the best angle of climb speed for a single engine, the airplane's not going to climb. If the speed decays at that point, there will come a point where he will no longer be able to control the roll that's being induced by this asymmetric yaw or asymmetric thrust condition. The only alternative then is to pull the power back on the operating engine and execute an off airport landing. So my guess would be the highest likelihood is that the airplane got slow and it just rolled into the ground, which is unfortunately one thing that twin engine airplanes will do if you don't have the adequate speed.
Yeah, great. Well, let's move along here. Like I said, rest in peace. That one did not end well. We do have a couple of stories here that did end well, and it was what I promoted for the show, and it had to do with this crash landing in Martha's Vineyard, an airport that I have flown out of, folks. I know what that's like there. A matter of fact, it was right after John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane went missing, and they were searching for it out there. So if you get in the Wayback Machine, that's when I was there. But I mentioned earlier that the captain's an analyst for NBC News, and this is a little snippet from NBC here to background us a little bit. Let me play this, and we'll talk afterwards.
A medical emergency.
Yeah, single aircraft down and approaching the runway 6, one patient responsive at the time.
This video posted online, unconfirmed by NBC News, but matching descriptions of the scene by Massachusetts State Police, showing first responders on the ground after a 79-year-old pilot became unresponsive midair before his female passenger took the controls.
What can you tell us about how difficult it might have been to land something like this?
It is not a trainer, so it's going to require more skill. It's going to approach the airport at higher speeds.
The small plane, a 2006 Piper Meridian, took off from Westchester, New York, Saturday afternoon en route to Martha's Vineyard. On final approach, the passenger had to jump into action, the plane's left wing breaking in half after a hard landing. Just last year, Darren Harrison made a similar heroic landing in Florida.
I've got a serious situation here. My pilot has gone incoherent.
We had now gone into a dive.
Harrison spoke to our Savannah Guthrie about taking control and safely landing with zero experience in the cockpit.
Because I knew it was a life or death situation. Either you do what you have to do to control the situation or you're going to die. And that's what I did.
Massachusetts State Police say the pilot was flown to a Boston hospital in serious life-threatening condition, and the passenger wasn't seriously hurt. Aaron Gilchrist, NBC News.
Okay, so that's great. That's a happy news story, and I got a lot of questions here, and that's kind of the first one. I like these things. I mean, I look into these, I see these videos, I watch them online and that type of thing. We tend to hear a lot about outcomes like this, where the passenger heroically is able to jump to the controls and get it on the ground and maybe walk away. But is that the rule or the exception, Captain? I don't know if any statistics have ever been made of this, but is that likely to happen, or is it a big news story just because it's so unlikely to happen?
A lot of it depends on where this all happens. And I mean, if you're at cruise altitude and you've got to go find an airport and align in the airplane with the runway and get the glide path down, I would say that the chances of a successful outcome are relatively low. On the other hand, if you have the airplane already aligned with the runway and it at a descent rate that's going to get you onto the airport, much less the runway, the outcome possibilities become much greater depending on the individual. And this lady did some remarkable things, is that she didn't panic. She just kept the flight path going in the direction it was, and she reduced the power and maintained a reasonable airspeed. The fact that it hit hard and without the landing gear, the airplane's replaceable. So the success of her handling an unexpected high-stress event, maintaining her cool, if you will, and I think that led very strongly to the successful outcome. I commend her for it.
Yeah, every word means something. So my journalism background, when these articles are authored, I look at every single word. I listen to every word in these video reports like we just saw. One thing that leapt out at me, the pilot was 79 years old now, and this is not the first time that an older pilot has experienced a medical emergency that's resulted in something like this. And my question is there any age limit to flying passengers on planes? Is there anything that, like, maybe if you're 80 years old, for instance, you can still fly people, but you got to have a co-pilot. You can't fly solo. Is there any rule like that on the books?
No, currently for private aircraft, there is not an age limit. For commercial airliners, there is at age 65, you have to retire. But for private airplanes, just like your private car, there is not an age restriction. Now, there is a check ride, a biennial check ride that pilots have to take, and physicals that they have to take. So it's not as though that they're unmonitored, but it's a little bit, it's probably a little bit much to say that age itself is a problem, because you see these rare pilot incapacitations, and they may be a heart issue or something of a 40-year-old. You also have them with someone that is at this point 79. There are people that can fly well into their 80s. I mean, I know some 80-plus-year-old pilots, and they're cautious. They're enjoying flying to this day. But there is no current restriction on pilot age other than insurance, which gets to be a problem, the biennial flight review, and keeping your physical up. So that's about as much regulation as there currently is.
And I've flown a lot, like a lot of people have, and I'm flying, and I've flown in small airplanes also. I was in a small plane with a guy one time that I thought had his act together, and he took his girlfriend, and my wife and I were riding in the back, and when we got to cruise in this small airplane, the guy was playing grab ass with his girlfriend in the front seat. I'm like, man, I don't, that's not a sterile cockpit by any stretch of the imagination. That was in a small plane. So I guess the question is, if you're going to fly in a small airplane, you probably ought to do your due diligence as far as the pilot is concerned, as best you can anyway. And then secondly, they have that advisory when you get on a commercial jet that tells you to, fasten your seatbelt, put your tray table up, and, here's the emergency exits and the oxygen mask and all that kind of stuff. Well, what about if you're flying in a small plane and you got one pilot? What about a placard or an advisory that would say, in the event of pilot incapacitation, which happens very rarely, here's what you should do. And I don't know if that can be put on a placard. I don't know if that can be in a briefing or a video. I mean, has there ever been any discussion of that?
There are too many variables in it, George. Where this would occur, the speeds, those sorts of things. Now, organizations like the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, they have training courses. They're called pitch hitter courses, where for passengers that are flying routinely on small aircraft, they can be taught the basics of navigation, the basics of communication with air traffic control, and basically the basics of how to land the airplane. And I would encourage, if you're going to fly in small airplanes, these courses are not prohibitively expensive, And it's a good skill set to have just in the unlikely event that your pilot becomes incapacitated. So a number of couples that I know where there's one pilot in the family and a regular passenger, but they do those pitch hitter courses. And I think that's a wise investment.
Okay, so let me bring this up on screen here. Now, this may not be exactly the cockpit of the plane in question, the Cessna Meridian. A couple of things right off the top. When I started to do the investigation into this, Captain, that's a very nice airplane, that Cessna Meridian. And this cockpit kind of bears that out. But let's say you're in the right seat there riding along, or you're in the back and you have to clamber up front because of pilot incapacitation. Now, I've done these circles and boxes and stuff here, and I don't know how to fly, folks, but I mean, just based on my basic knowledge of some important things that you need to know or do if this were to happen to you. And maybe the first thing is, if the pilot has become incapacitated, causing him to slump forward you got to get him off of there. I mean, that's the first thing that you got to do, obviously, get the pilot back. But then there's some immediate things you got to look at and try to do. One of them is to communicate, and yeah, you can take it from there, Captain.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's to keep the airplane flying. So whatever the power setting is, what's the airspeed? Is it a reasonable airspeed? Is the airplane descending or climbing? So all of those come into to account here. So the biggest thing is you need to get the incapacitated pilot away from the controls, slide the seat back, and restrain them. And the next thing is to see where you are, and the blue there is a sky, is a horizon. So you can keep that oriented where the blue is up. You're doing well. And then there are things that you can help that these pitch hitter courses will teach you. It's things like how to ease the control forces in the wheel when you pull back and when you push forward. That's called trim, and how to trim the airplane. The Piper Meridian is a high-speed airplane. It's a beautifully designed machine, but it has a turbine engine, a jet engine turning a propeller. It's a turboprop, so it has a lot of power. But comes with that, when you apply power, you have to push in right rudder. Otherwise, the airplane's going to start to turn to the left. So there's a lot of handling things like that. So the fewer adjustments you make, probably the better. And if you're aligned with the runway, don't change a lot, and just get it to the runway and go ahead and get it on the ground. If you're off to the side of the runway, that's fine too.
Just to identify what I've got here now, on the right there, I've got that narrow rectangular box there. That's the yoke. I mean, that's the thing you got to get the captain off of, if that's where he's at. That's your up and down. It's also, to a certain extent, your left and right, and the buttons at the top of the yoke. Oftentimes, you got to put the headset on. I mean, you got to be able to talk on the radio. That would help if you need help to call for it, I guess. And I'm thinking, a lot of people don't know, Captain, that those push to talk buttons are right there.
They are, but there may be, and oftentimes are, several buttons on there. So you may have to try more than one to be able to get to the correct switch that you depress while you're transmitting, and then release. And once you release it, then you can receive information from air traffic control.
Yeah, and again, hopefully nobody ends up in this circumstance. And the other thing on the far left, top left here, that I have a little rectangular box around, I think that's the autopilot, and that could be a lifesaver for you as well. Talk about that a little bit.
All of the high-performance airplanes, and increasingly, the autopilots, if you can engage them, they will keep the airplane right side up. They will fly a given compass heading if you tell it to. They will maintain an altitude if you tell it to. So having a basic knowledge of how to utilize the autopilot to get and fly a heading, which air traffic control can get you to an airport, just so long as you fly the heading that they tell you to do that. And so if you're a regular passenger in one of these airplanes, it would be a very good idea to have your pilot show you how to engage the autopilot, show you how to talk on the radio, how to adjust the frequency of the radio. That'll go a long way in getting you help. The good news, George, is that technology is coming to the rescue here. On some of the new general aviation airplanes, they have a system that is an automatic land in an emergency system. You depress that and it notifies air traffic control that you have an emergency. It goes to the nearest airport. It extends the landing gear, slows the airplane down, and puts it on the runway for you. And that is currently available in some models of the newer generation airplanes.
Oh, I did not know that. Well, again, to kind of run through the schematic with my rudimentary circling and boxes here. Airspeed, the captain talked about. You're on the headset there. They're going to want to do that. That's the little circle there. The center column is usually where the throttles are located, I think, in most instances on a lot of these planes. Right next to it, then the vertical rectangular box, this trim wheel thing. Now, I may not be correct about that, but I remember when I was flying with Captain Jack, particularly on approach on landing, man, he was working that trim wheel a lot. What's that all about?
It's taking control, it's taking forces out of the control so you don't have to push and hold a force on it. There's small tabs in the back of the airplane that will reduce that force so that if you want to descend at, say, 500 feet a minute, you can trim the airplane and it will fly that 500 feet per minute. So you utilize trim a lot. And so if you're in a climb and you want to maintain a given airspeed, you trim the airplane to where it holds that pitch in the climb. And so the trim gets utilized a lot. You trim pretty much based on feel to keep the controlled forces so that you're not having to push down on the yoke hard or to pull back on it. And that's what it's for.
And then right in the center there is the circle, and this one's pretty easy to locate. That's the landing gear. I mean,
that's actually probably the flaps.
Oh, that is okay. All right, my bad. Yeah,
which is panels on the back of the wing that help it slow down and to create additional lift at lower speeds. If you look to the left of the circle, you'll see a little red dot there. That's probably the landing gear handle.
Ah, okay, good. And I can actually,
yeah, you can see there little three small green indicators right there. That's the 3 landing gear.
Okay, good. And then what about the pedals? And this is because everybody's going to wonder about that too. What do I do with these things? Well, those are the rudders. Are you going to use that trying to land, or is that for just after you land, or what are the rudders for?
The rudder will it will move the nose left and right. You probably don't need to use them a whole lot. Once you're on the ground, pushing the rudders left and right will also help you track the airplane, assuming the landing gear's down and you're on a runway. And also on the top of those pedals is where the brakes are. So if you're on the runway slowing down, you can utilize those brakes to bring the airplane to a stop.
Okay, great. I mean, there's a little explanation for you. God, let's hope it doesn't happen to you. Hopefully you can get on a headset and get some help. That oftentimes does happen, and hopefully it's daylight and, you're not in, that's right. The other part of it. If it's dark or you're in a storm or something, I mean, oh man, that's probably not going to,
a lot of variables.
Not going to end well. Okay, so let's do a little updating here, talking about not ending well. I was kind of wanting to update this. Captain and I did a show a couple of years ago about this cargo plane in Hawaii. And this is from the Associated Press. Pilots' confusion over which engine was failing caused a 2021 cargo plane crash off Hawaii, the NTSB says. Pilots' confusion over which engine was failing caused that crash. And federal investigators say a cargo plane ditched into the ocean off Hawaii in 2021. And Captain and I were on the air right after that because pilots identified the wrong engine that was failing and didn't have enough power to remain airborne. Okay, before we go any further, I want you to talk, because you would think everybody knows all about planes and aviation, and, we all know about vehicles and cars and trucks and that kind of stuff, but we don't think about very often cargo planes. And I was surprised reading into this story that these guys were cargo plane pilots and they flew the same routes over and over with multiple stops. I mean, the redundancy of what these guys were confronted with, and it may have played a role in this crash. I don't know. But to talk about flying cargo, Captain, and were you always a passenger pilot, or did you fly cargo also?
I've primarily flown passengers throughout my career, both as in corporate, and then I flew for a passenger airline. We certainly carried cargo, but it wasn't our primary task. So in this case, the cargo airplanes oftentimes are older, and this was an older generation 737. The pilots were highly experienced. Some of them had been furloughed from passenger airlines and others. The first officer was about to upgrade to captain. The captain was a very experienced 737 captain. They routinely fly, particularly in the islands. It's the same routes over and over and over. There's limited number of destinations, and so they're literally moving freight between the islands on a daily basis. And this operator had several 737s, and they were configured to carry the maximum amount of cargo that they could. On this departure coming out of Honolulu, they experienced an engine problem. These are older generation engines that I've flown for thousands of hours. They're very reliable. They're well built, but they are older generation. And this one engine, the left engine on the airplane, began to degrade in the thrust output. The temperatures were going up, the output was going down. So, and the first officer was a flying pilot. They initially correctly identified and then incorrectly identified it. But George, the interesting part of this is it shows human biases, particularly in stress conditions. If you believe something, you will look for evidence to support that belief. And the continuation of a belief can cause you to overlook evidence that conflicts with it. And that's what occurred here. They got confused and they convinced themselves that the right engine was the problem when in fact it was the left. And they pulled the power back to slow down, knowing that they were going to return to land at Honolulu. And when they pushed the power back up, they left the good engine back at idle and were trying to get power from the failing left engine. And that bias maintained, they continued that, even in the fact that the airspeeds and the temperatures and everything was showing the right engine was still running. They didn't utilize it. And so it's a real insight into human performance and the different biases that go on when humans are put in high stress conditions.
Yeah, let me see what else is in this article here. The captain was seriously injured. He's recovering. I know the co-pilot suffered minor injuries and the plane was destroyed. The NTSB said Thursday the plane was owned by Rhodes Aviation and operated as a trans-air cargo flight. I wanted to play this clip. I talked about the captain and I talking about this a couple of years ago. Here's the clip. This won't take very long. We'll come back right after this. It kind of also has a graphic in it that shows the flight path and so on, but here it is.
We don't have he has one, and fuel is about 2 hours of fuel.
And Rose Express 810, how many people are on board?
2 of us.
Rose Express 810, roger. Do you have the airport in sight? Rose Express 810, do you have the airport in sight?
Negative.
Oh, and Rose Express 810, low altitude alert. Low altitude alert. Are you able to climb at all?
No, negative.
Yeah. They're going in the water.
Yeah,
that's the other pilot, probably the captain. And that's the low altitude alert. This is a little bit unusual. They don't tell the controller that they're out of 2,000 feet. She sees it on the radar and says low altitude alert. And that's a perfect call from her because she's warning them, hey, you're getting close to the ground or the water. And then the voices change, and we're not going to make the airport. That's the first time that you hear that, and it's the other voice. So they know that they've got a really serious situation here.
Yeah, so that one didn't go well for those guys. They didn't end up at the bottom of the drink. They were on the plane or near it, and they were able to be rescued and that type of thing. But I will say this, Captain, at the time, I recall this from the show, you said this is weird. I mean, this is bizarre. I mean, the two good engines, good manufactured engines on this plane. This should not have happened. And I was speculating that maybe it was bad fuel, maybe bad maintenance, but whatever the circumstance might be. Yeah, it was weird. And as you mentioned, it ends up being a pilot error situation.
It does. But as I say, it shows how when you come to believe something, how frail that decision may be. And yet you'll continue on that path. And so there's a lesson learned for pilots and people in general is keep if things aren't going the way that you expect, go back and look at the assumptions that you've made in there, because they may not necessarily be valid. And you can then find up till nearly the end, had they pushed that right engine up, they could have returned to the airport. So and this is what was so strange about it in the early days, was there was one call that says the other engine's overheating.
Yeah.
JT8s, which is the type of engine that's on that airplane, they're not known to overheat. And to have an engine failure and then have the other one overheat, we're down now into the likelihood of that was extraordinarily low, which is what prompted my comment. There's something very odd here. And now we, after the investigation, we know what that was.
I always like to encourage people, of course, to comment and leave questions for the captain. This goes back to the earlier situation. Suzanne was asking the question, can a novice use an ILS system to land a plane if they would have to? Is that a possibility?
If you know how to read the instrument landing system that was known by the acronym ILS, if you know how to read the ILS and you're gentle with the airplane, it will give you very good information. But it's a matter of knowing how to tune it to get to receive the ground transmitted information into the airplane, and then how to interpret it, and then take that interpretation into flight control inputs to get the desired flight path. So can a novice? Yes, if they have the sufficient knowledge and skill, absolutely. There's no prohibition of any sort about using it. And the ILS is what pilots typically use in good weather and in bad for vertical and lateral alignment with the runway.
Yeah, it sounds great, because the glide slope shows you the up and down, the height, where you need to come in so that you're coming in at the right angle, at the right altitude, and that type of thing. The left and right shows you whether or not you're on the side. I mean, it sounds good, but you got to be able to tune and adjust and use and understand what the ILS is.
The closer you get to the runway, the more sensitive it gets, so that very small deviations can result in a lot of deflection on the needles or on the indicators. And so if you are not pretty gentle with the airplane, all of a sudden you're way too high or way too low according to the instrument landing system guidance. So it takes some practice.
Okay, great. I want to throw this up on screen. This is from Mason McDougall. He's a hockey buddy of mine. I had a show actually on. He's a guy that does lawn maintenance, landscaping, and snow removal, and that type of thing. A huge industry, by the way. My God, I can't believe how much money is spent on this type of thing. But he's listening in this morning while he's mowing. So I like Mason. I just wanted to throw that up on screen. Okay, let me get to this one, because I did mention this very briefly earlier, and this bears a little bit of an explanation. This is from Phil Starr Global. Airlines are grappling with the rise in turbulent passengers. Yeah. Let me get into this a little bit. Viral videos of vulgar, intoxicated, and violent airplane passengers have become common, including there was a woman on the I think had some mental issues. You probably saw that one here just in the last few weeks. But it's not just a social media trend. Statistics confirm cases are on the rise. So it's not your imagination, folks. The surge in incidents come as the aviation industry is bouncing back from the COVID pandemic, with airlines expecting to fly a near record 4.35 billion, that's with a B, passengers this year. My God. Now, according to the industry trade group IATA, 1 in every 568 flights, 1 in every 568 had an incident linked to an unruly passenger in 2022. That's when we were on the crazy train of COVID, compared to 1 flight in 835 flights in 2021. That's how much it spiked. The United States saw a 10-fold rise in violent incidents from 2017 to 2021. Now, that's not COVID, folks. That's just societal, or who knows, a 10-fold increase to 6,000, with the politicization of mask wearing during the pandemic responsible for many confrontations. This was a crazy time. People did a lot of strange things, said JetBlue CEO Robin Hayes. That has come back down a lot since the masking rules went away. It's still, okay, masking drove people crazy, folks. It's still slightly elevated compared to 2019, but it's largely back to normal. Now, that's come back down a lot since the masking rules went away. Oh, wait a minute. I read that earlier. So, okay, here's the next slide. Undercover officers often travel on routes, and the captain had talked about that, where there are frequent problems. But for the most part, it's the cabin crew who have to handle problem passengers. They are trained in psychology to de-escalate situations as well as self-defense. If dialogue and warnings fail, airplanes are equipped with plastic handcuffs now to restrain uncontrollable passengers in their seats. As a last resort, the captain can divert the plane and make all passengers disembark. And the captain said before on the show, he has no problem with that. I mean, if it means safety for everybody involved, that plane's going to land and that person's going to be taken off. They're going to go to jail. It's going to cost them a ton of money. So I just wanted to start off that way, Captain, and maybe get your opinion now. We talked about passengers a little bit with this unruly situation. There might be a circumstance where at the very least you might want to report something that you see, or that, you know, that's unsafe for yourself and other passengers around you. Or maybe, depending on the circumstance, you might even have to do something. You think, or not?
Well, I mean, the unruly passengers is an ongoing problem. And the fact that the actions of one person can put the safety of the entire airplane in jeopardy. And that's not acceptable by any stretch. So the tolerance that we have as a society for those individuals, I think that needs to be tightened down, and that needs to be increased penalties. It needs to be increased fines, incarceration. But we cannot tolerate unruly passengers. Now, that said, if we have someone that is posing a threat to the airplane, the cabin crew is trained how to handle it. But if they can't handle it, there have been cases where passengers have assisted the cabin crew in restraining someone. And that's appropriate if the cabin crew ask. I would not in any way advocate that passengers take it upon themselves. But if asked by a cabin crew member for help, I would encourage you to do so. And if that requires restraining an individual, so be it. Now, the pilots, if you're restraining an individual, they're going to be probably trying to divert the airplane. And then from that point, once they get on the ground, is to have law enforcement deal with it. And they should be charged both by state, if it's a domestic flight, both for infractions of state statutes as well as federal ones. And so they can and should be charged in multiple jurisdictions. And I have no tolerance for this. So as far as I'm concerned, the penalties should be harsh. And the fact that, and it should be publicized, because if we can inspire someone not to become unruly by the recognition of the consequence of it, then we've avoided the situation entirely, and that would be desirable. But we have people today that feel entitled, that they're entitled to do something, and the videos now show that, and it's very tragic because you've bought a ticket on the airplane does not entitle you to fly. There are rules of carriage, and those are legally binding. So you yelling at a flight attendant or threatening a flight attendant is the one thing it's going to do is it's going to get a response from law enforcement, and that's appropriate. So it's just a word of warning. Additionally, I would like to see the airlines exchange no-fly lists so that if you've had a problem with a passenger that is on airline A, that airlines B, C, and D also know that this is a problem-plagued passenger. So, and the airlines maintain no-fly list within for themselves, but so far there has not been a federal mandate to share that. And I'd like to see that because I have no tolerance for people who put the airplane and fellow passengers at risk.
Again, my microphone was off there. What about the rate of incidents? Do you think it's going to table? I mean, are we hitting a plateau here with this kind of behavior, or is this something we're just going to have to learn to live with, and it's going to probably get worse before it gets better?
It has stabilized about where it was before COVID. The bulk of the problems were mask issues, people refusing to wear a mask and then demanding that they bought this ticket and that they were entitled or had a right to that seat, which in fact is false. But the flight attendants were in the position of they're instructed to enforce this. They don't dream these rules up. Those came from the FAA, but they're required to enforce them. So yelling at a flight attendant or threatening a flight attendant it accomplishes nothing other than to get you removed from the airplane. So we've seen the numbers go down with the mask rules being reduced or eliminated now. And I think that we're going to see, unfortunately, I think that we're going to see some continuation of this, but I hope that it doesn't continue to go up.
Well, and I just looked at the clock. Believe it or not, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I like to hold these to an hour or so just in consideration for our guest time. If nothing else, the captain's very good to come on here with us almost for an hour. Now, I'll say this. This is my opinion. It's kind of weird, so it's not the captain's opinion, but I think that the proliferation of this type of behavior to a certain extent has to do with the internet, and I encourage everybody to think of the Ku Klux Klan. How? Why? Well, here's why. How did those guys do that? Why did they do that? Back in the day, they were wearing hoods. They were anonymous. They were running around out there doing those horrible types of things in a group of like-minded individuals anonymously. Well, think of the internet. Think of what we're doing online, folks, and it seems to be seeping into every corner of society. And I think that's at least a small reason for the kind of behavior that we're seeing today. Now, there's other societal things as well, but in some respects, I think that social media is to blame for that. Well, we're out of time too. I wanted to bring this up on screen here. Okay. This is Gary Larson. I've had him up before. We talked about how passengers can do something maybe to help or cause a plane accident. This is from the far side, which doesn't publish anymore, Gary Larson. And everybody that's rode on a jet airliner can remember you got those controls with you get a headset radio and I don't know, maybe a fan or something or a light. But this has a button on it that says wings stay on, wings fall off. I always kind of wondered about those controls on the seat for passengers. Captain, you've been great to come on here again today and listen to me ramble on. Always like to give you last word because you are the expert here. Out of the topics that we talked about, all the way from the FAA hearings in Congress to these plane crashes to people being prepared to do something as a passenger on a small plane to a large plane, how would you wrap up the show?
I think, George, for the show today, let's fund the FAA on long-term funding. Let's increase the funding to it. We are continuing to increase our utilization of our aviation assets, and the regulation and oversight needs to grow with it. The FAA is not a place where we need to be cutting things back. It is not the big government monster that some people portray it. It is, in fact, one of the leading regulators in the world. And we have an incredibly safe aviation system due in part to the efforts by the FAA. So I think that knowing that the bill for FAA funding is being debated now, I'd finish up today with, let's encourage our political leaders to take the politics out of the FAA funding and increase the funding to them so that they can do the job to which they have been tasked.
That's great. And again, what I said earlier about the government spending money on things that I would like, everything the captain just said. And then also, let's spend some money on making these planes more ecologically friendly, but in fuel. I mean, hydrogen, electric, all of these types of new wave, high tech types of things. That's how I want my money spent. Goes to the lunar landing anniversary that we're talking about today. I mean, that's what we have the NASA program for. That's what we do this type of thing for. Let's bring those things into play to help ourselves be safer and to help the world survive. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Captain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The good news is aviation is becoming increasingly green. The engines today burn far less fuel than those of the past, and that evolution of efficiency is continuing. They're looking at sustainable jet fuel that is made from things other than fossil fuel, and I think over time you'll see that be a larger percentage. And then we're looking at, for the shorter flights, electric aircraft. That technology is coming along. They're looking at the potential of hydrogen. So the push in the research area and in the infancy of technologies to improve the footprint. Now, if we could just get some of the other industries to do the same thing, aviation gets a lot of media attention about the amount of fossil fuel they burn. But when you look at the overall pollution, the either methane or CO2, aviation's way down the list. Let's go look at the large factories. Let's go look at a global approach to it, so that not just the US or not just Canada or not just Europe, but let's look at all of it so that we address the largest contributors to this, to climate change, to the increase in greenhouse gases. Let's go there. Aviation's doing their part, but let's go elsewhere.
God, that's well said. The captain's a Missouri boy. He spent a lot of his young life in Iowa, of course. I'm here in the heartland, and I tell everybody animal agriculture is right at the top of the list. It's like we're in a race to kill ourselves with greenhouse gas emissions, or maybe if we don't do that, to eat ourselves to death. Let's eat fewer. Let's eat less, eat fewer animals, and that'll help everybody. Captain, thanks again. As always, we'll circle back. You fly safe, you fly well, and we'll talk again soon on Podcast by George.
Good to see you, George. Thanks.
This has been great. And folks, if you like Podcast by George and Captain Cox and the opportunity to talk to somebody that knows what he's talking about, a real aviation expert, and somebody that's seen on your NBC nightly news on Podcast by George, subscribe to us. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and you can sign up on Facebook or YouTube there. The little icons, the badges for those platforms are located on my site, and you just click on them and it'll take you right to Facebook or YouTube. You can, on YouTube, ring the notification bell, subscribe, follow us on Facebook. It's easily done. Then in audio, if you like to listen along like Mason was, remember him earlier out mowing? If you like to listen to the podcast, go to iTunes. That's a great place. The badge is there on podcastbygeorge.com. Click that one. Or Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Stitcher, Deezer, all of the places where podcasts are heard. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.